Hello, welcome to Hebrews 1 Ministries, and today is the second part of a 2-video series. So in the first video we looked at the crucifixion of Jesus. If you haven't checked that out already, the link's in the description below. I would suggest that you watch that before watching this one, but if you just want to watch this one, that's still fine, you'll still get a lot out of it. Okay, I'm keen, I hope you are too. Let's get into talking about the resurrection. So following on from last week, we know at this point that Jesus is dead, but the question is, did he rise, or is he still dead? Christianity hinges on the resurrection. This question is massive. It's like the foundation of the Christian faith, because the Apostle Paul says that if Christ was not raised from the dead, then the whole Christian faith is a sham. It's just a stupid waste of time. And they sound like harsh words, but I think it gives Christianity an edge, because our entire belief system can be proven or disproven based on one historical event. And so Christians openly invite everyone to go back to this one event in history, examine the evidence, and make their own decision based on the best explanation that fits the evidence. In the past, you may have rejected Christianity because you weren't sure about the idea of a global flood or a talking snake. And I do understand where you're coming from. There are some things in the Bible that are not easy to get our heads around. But please don't throw out the whole of Christianity because you find it hard to believe in some of the stories that you've heard about or read in the Bible. The truth of Christianity comes down to this one question: did Jesus Christ rise bodily from the dead? And there's so much I could go into on this topic. The resurrection account is recorded in all four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as well as the book of Acts. And the resurrection is continually mentioned throughout the whole New Testament. But I'll condense it as best I can to give you an overview of the evidence, but while still going into enough detail to prove it. So there's a method used by somebody smarter than me, Lee Strobel, who uses the 4 E's method to establish the validity and the credibility of the resurrection. So the first E is the execution of Jesus. This was firmly established last week. As you'll see in part 1, Jesus was dead. This historical fact is not even disputed by any expert on the historical Jesus, skeptics and atheists and agnostics alike. Secondly, early accounts. There are people that believe that the resurrection account is a myth and a legend. However, legends take hundreds of years to develop, and usually by the people who weren't around to see the actual events themselves. But with the resurrection, we have historical data that goes back to within months of the resurrection event. This historical data from primary sources is far too early and close to the event to be dismissed as a legendary development. 30. Empty tomb. So the tomb of Jesus was empty. If the Roman or Jewish authorities had the body, they would have shown it to everyone, and that would have been the end of the Christian upstart movement, which they would have wanted. But Jesus' corpse was never produced, and the tomb remained empty. Also quickly on this, if the disciples had stolen the body, as soon as they were threatened with death, don't you think that they would have said, okay, here's the body, you've got us, just don't kill us. You know, it was a joke, it was a hoax, whatever, just take the body, here he is, and we'll go back to living our normal lives. Don't execute us. But every single one of them went to their deaths proclaiming that Jesus had risen. Not something that people would likely do if they knew he hadn't actually risen and they had the body. 4th E, eyewitnesses. So 1 Corinthians 15:6 is a massive passage of the resurrection. It says, after that, he, Jesus, appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. So this is Paul writing this passage, and he's saying, if you don't believe me that Jesus is risen, even though I've seen him, go and ask the other people who saw Jesus. Hundreds of them are still alive. If Paul knew that they were all making up a story, would he really say, go and ask those hundreds of people who he appeared to at the same time? Because if it wasn't true, even just one of them would have said, no, it's not true. But he trusted that all those hundreds of people would accurately report what they saw. In total, Jesus appeared alive to more than 515 people, and some of those were in groups and some of them were one-to-one over a period of 40 days after his resurrection. And not only to the believers, but he also appeared to some skeptics and doubters and even enemies who became believers after they encountered the risen Jesus. Some of the most famous examples of these are his brother James and the persecutor of the church, Saul. And one of the most important facts I touched on earlier was that every single disciple was killed for proclaiming the resurrection. All they had to do was just say, no, it's not true, and they could just get on with their lives. But they were all willing to die. Why? Well, obviously I think it's because they were so convinced that they saw, touched, and ate with Jesus that they were willing to lose their very lives for it. And these men aren't depicted as brave, heroic, strong, courageous men. We know that over the Easter weekend, before they knew of the resurrection, they were hiding together in a locked house because they were fearful that if the Roman or the Jewish authorities found them, then they would suffer the same fate that Jesus did. And it was actually the women that went and found Jesus at the tomb because the men were still too scared to go out in case they were seen by the authorities. So what could possibly turn this group of cowards into some of the most bold and courageous martyrs of all time? Well, it's got to be nothing short than a resurrection, because people might die for something they genuinely believe is true, but people almost never die for something they know is a lie, like these guys could have truly known. And these guys said that they saw him alive after his death, so I'm taking their word for it, especially after they literally lost everything, including their very lives, just to proclaim this message. I remember a funny quote that says, "When you have breakfast on the beach with your dead rabbi, you lose all your fear of death." Now let me finish by outlining what this means for us. Jesus is alive. Today, Jesus sits on the throne of God and has control over all creation. The implications of the resurrection are too massive to ignore. We're talking about God coming to earth, dying, and rising for our sins. If this is true, this is the biggest thing for anyone alive today. Because if Jesus lives, then we know that we can have a personal relationship with God. And we can also know that our sins are forgiven through the cross. Every time Jesus claimed that he was going to die and then rise again in 3 days, think of it like Jesus writing checks. And he's making all these claims that he's going to come back from the dead. He's saying that he has the power to come through on these claims, and that he plans to do exactly that. So then he dies. Everybody thinks he's failed in his mission. All his disciples abandon him in his biggest hour of need. And then the women come back from the tomb and say he is risen. The disciples still don't believe him. But when they see Jesus risen, and they touch him, and they eat with him, this is when the check clears. This is when all the claims that Jesus made come true. And that is how we can know that Jesus is who he says he is. I've heard it put like this: if you're going to claim to die and then come back from the dead, and you actually pull it off, I'm going to listen to anything you have to say. And while that is a funny way to put it, if he proved that he was who he said he was with the resurrection, then everything he said leading up to that was true about himself, because he came through on his biggest and most difficult claim, that he was going to rise from the dead after 3 days. So therefore, everything else that he said leading up to that, every other claim, is true. So that's the resurrection. I love talking about it. I could talk about this all day because it really is the central pillar of our faith. This makes or breaks Christianity. So if you really want to talk about Christianity, you talk about the crucifixion and the resurrection. So it's been awesome to talk about it in a 2-part series. I've loved making it. I enjoy talking about it always, as I said. And there are a lot smarter people than me who have much more detailed analysis of the resurrection. I just gave a brief overview so that you could begin to get an idea about if there is any evidence for it. As I mentioned, Lee Strobel is probably the best. He's dedicated his whole life to proving the evidence for the resurrection. So I'll link some of his videos in the description below if you want to check it out further. And I also really recommend his books, The Case for Christ and The Case for the Real Jesus. These are excellent books that I enjoyed reading, talking to the world's leading scholars, atheist and Christian, about where does the evidence point. Or if you're more of a movie buff, there's a great movie called Risen, which gives a great insight into the things discussed today.